Okay, we have one more that we're going to talk about. I have 2 programs left. If anyone didn't get one, see me and I'll make sure you got one. And again, someone probably got one that when you opened it up, it was upside down. So if you want to trade me, I'll trade you. Okay, the last one we're going to talk about is Reverend James Ball Woolard, and Todd Nichols is going to talk about him.
A couple things before I start. People, I don't know, for some reason think I can speak, I guess because my dad was a minister, that's where we moved to Mulberry. And I taught school for 29 years, but if you ask any of my students, and you can ask Adam, I yell at them a lot. But I promise not to yell at you tonight. And I'm from Mulberry, but I'm not from Mulberry. We moved here in the summer of 1979. Most of my family is from like the Wagner, Farmersville area. As a matter of fact, if you're old enough to remember, my grandfather operated a city service station on Route 66 in Wagner. So that's kind of where my family's from. But Cindy asked me to talk about Reverend J.B. Ball, which was James Ball Woolard. He was one of the first settlers. I found this information here. He was one of the first settlement improvement made in what is known as Mulberry Grove was made about the year 1826 by a man named Zophar Foster. On the place now occupied by Reverend James Woolard. Now, as I read this, when I found this on the internet, this is actually a history book about Bond County, Montgomery County. When I started reading this, I'm like, well, this talks about Mr. Woolard still living here. Well, I looked and the book was written in 1882. So this is kind of first-hand account of a little about a history of Mulberry. It says in 1826 by Zophar Foster, on the place now occupied by Reverend James Woolard. And that place is actually, it goes on down here, is the area where the ag farm, the FFA ag farm was. So that was where the first cabin was built here in Mulberry Grove. It says the next settlers after Foster were a gentleman named John Bellew and Duncan Johnson, who came in about 1829. And they were from Tennessee. Reverend James B. Woolard came from North Carolina and was the next permanent settler. He came to the county in 1831. He's about age 27, and purchased the improvements of Zophar Foster, where he resided ever since, a period of more than 50 years that he lived there. It says here that Mr. Woolard lived an active life, being closely identified with Bond County throughout a long period of time. A lot of this information, it says, comes from a published sketch of his life. We exactly for 2 facts and incidents that probably will be interesting to the reader. Also in here, I got a little bit of Mulberry Grove history in here that I found interesting. It says that I found this interesting because if you go over where his tombstone is over there, he actually has, I think there's an original tombstone. It's very dark. I can't read it. And I could barely make out his name on it, but there's a military tombstone, and then there's like a monument there, and I think that monument was put up later for him because he was such an instrumental person in the early history of Mulberry Grove. Lost my place here. He was born there in Carolina, brought up principally in Tennessee, and when he as we have said, he came to Bond County in 1831, locating a place where he still lives. In the spring of 1832, the next year, he came here upon the call of Governor Reynolds for volunteers for the Black Hawk War. He enlisted as one of the 50 men comprising the quota of Bond County. The money received for his services is what he purchased the property, as this tells us. Also, I found in another place he had also served as a chaplain in the 111th Infantry in the Civil War. So that's another thing that J.B. Ball was. He says he entered his first 40 acres of land. He bought 40 acres of land upon which he lives to this day. In a few years, by industry and economy, he was able to add until he was the owner of 600 acres. So he eventually he owned 600 acres in that area of the FFA. So I found that kind of interesting. Of his religious life, might be said, which space will not permit. I'm kind of reading this, and they kind of talk funny back then, so I'm trying to paraphrase this as I go. He made a profession of religion, joined the Methodist Episcopal Church, served as a class leader and licensed exhorter. In the fall of 1829, was licensed as a local preacher. His license was signed by Reverend Peter Cartwright, presiding elder in 1883. He was ordained deacon by Bishop R.R. Roberts. Also a point, here's a point of interest down here. We mentioned John Bilyeu, who was mentioned in one of the first settlers in the precinct, and who built his cabin near where the village of Mulberry Grove now stands, erected a horse mill where they milled grain in an early day upon the near the site of the Methodist Church. And later on, I found in there where the Methodist Church is right now, that's where that mill was. And when he quit running the mill, he donated that to the Methodist Church, and that's where they built their building. So it's kind of interesting where all this stuff fell in the community. Reverend Ball was the first election held in the neighborhood under a tree near the dwelling of Bennett Seagraves. About 1833 to 1834, Reverend J.B. Woolard and Dury Petty were the judges of this election. And the people that were elected were John Russell and William Hunter were the candidates for legislature. The first post office was established in the year 1834 to 1835, and J.B. Woolard was the first appointed postmaster. And it also says right here that that's when the name Mulberry Grove was given to the town, because they've been referred to as Houston and Shakerag, and I think there was one other that I found. But
Houston.
Do what?
Houston,
yes. Anyhow, he gave the town the name Mulberry Grove, which stuck because there was a grove of mulberry trees found around his cabin. A couple other things right here. Again, that was in the area of the FFA farm, so that's actually where the first post office was, because the Opal operated the post office out of his cabin, and that's actually where he conducted his first worship services, out of his cabin there out there where the FFA farm is now. Also, I found, and this isn't verified, but I found another manuscript that said he represented Bond County in the legislature in the year 1844 to 1845. So, you know, he done a lot of things. It says, as soon as a sufficient number of people had settled in the neighborhood, a schoolhouse was built and the school established. And Mr. Ball had a hand in helping build this schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was of the regular pioneer type, being of the rudest architecture and having the usual puncheon floor, stick chimney, great wide fireplace. The school was taught on a subscription plan, as was the custom then. But the name of the first teacher was not obtained. On Sunday, the building was used as a temple of worship where the pioneers gathered to hear the word. Near this house, a cemetery was laid out, and it says here the first person who died in the precinct was a Mrs. Margaret Riley, and was buried in the cemetery. So, if you find her stone, this, according to this, is the
If
first.
you find that, tell me, that's mine.
But that was the first person buried out here. Also, that schoolhouse and church was built in the area right there where his tombstone is. So that's where that building was. if you go over there on that monument, it explains that on that monument to him over there. So, now here's just an interesting fact I found here about Mulberry Grove. This is, he's talking about the town. He says that the town, remember this is 1882, it says the town at present shows the following businesses. It says 3 to 4 general stores, grocery stores, plural, so there's evidently more than one. It says drug stores, blacksmith, wagon, carpenter and shoe shops, flour and sawmill, several physicians, 2 churches, and an excellent school, and it says the population about that time was 500 souls. So that was in 1882. The Methodist Episcopal Church at Mulberry Grove was organized by Reverend J.B. Woolard about the year 1830 with a membership of 6 besides himself and his wife. His wife's name was, I believe it was Mary, yes. With membership of 6. It's got a list of them here. The officers were Duncan Johnson and his wife, John Bilyeu and his wife, Zophar Foster and his wife. Duncan Johnson was the first class leader, and it said Williams Chambers and Wilson Pittman were the first ministers. This church has since grown to a large congregation, which several other churches have been formed. The old log house already mentioned was the first place of worship and served as a church for several years. As I read this, I think that after it moved from here, it was to the location it's at now, and I think there was a building in between, and that's actually, from what I understand from this, the building that's there now is the 3rd building that was standing when this was written. There's been some changes to it, but that's the building. I found that this was another interesting fact about Mulberry Grove in this article. It says, or in this book, Mulberry Grove Village is provided with excellent schools. The school has been graded for the past 8 years. There are 2 school buildings, 1 brick, and 1 other a modern frame, 2-story high, costing about, get this, Dan, $2,600. 3 teachers are employed, and the average attendance was 150 children. And that was in 1882. I don't think I'll read it, but I found this interesting. I found a letter that was on the internet that Mr. Ball wrote to his wife when he was at a preaching convention, and then I think that was in 1831, I believe it was. But it's kind of interesting how it's worded. I would try to read it, but as Julie knows, it's worded kind of funny, and I stumble over my tongue. But it was interesting that it was there. A little bit about the family. Of course, Reverend James Ball Woolard. He was born December 16, 1804 in North Carolina. He died on May 4th, 1887, and he was 83 years old, and he was buried here in the Mulberry Cemetery. His stone is right over in that corner over there. His wife was Mary McCurley Woolard, born March 24th, 1805 in Kentucky, and she died August 20th, 1883 at the age of 78, and she's buried in the cemetery. I believe there's a tombstone near his grave over there. He had 5 children. His first child was Nancy Rebecca Woolard Vest. She was born February 22nd, 1828 in Tennessee, and died July 22nd, 1903 at 75 years old. And she's buried here in the Mulberry Grove Cemetery somewhere. The second child was, the oldest son was Washington Wesley Woolard. If you go over there by his tombstone, his son's tombstone is right next to it. And there's, I think there's his tombstone, and I think there's actually a military tombstone there for him also. He was born here in Bond County in 1834 and died January 9th, 1882 at the age of, they got 47 or 48, they're not sure there. And he is buried in the Mulberry Grove Cemetery. Also, I found that the year that Reverend James Ball died, that's when his grandson was born, which would be Wesley Woolard's son, and he was named after his grandfather. His name was James Ball Woolard also. He was born here in Mulberry, and it says he was buried out in Los Angeles, California in 1933. Died at the age of 54. The third child was Frances Marion Woolard. He was born January 28th, 1835 at Mulberry Grove, and died in 1927, or February 27th, 1916 at the age of 81. And then there was Mary S. Woolard. She was born 1837 and died in 1876, and she's buried in Mulberry Grove Cemetery. So 3 of his kids are buried here in the cemetery. The last child, Margaret Isidore Woolard, born in 1843, and she died in 1903 at the age of 60. She's buried in Montrose Cemetery in Greenville. So it was pretty interesting. Like I said, Cindy, I said, "Oh, you gave me the oldest one here. I've never met the guy." all these people, everybody have met here in Mulberry. But it sounds like Mr. Woolard played an important role in the early history here. Lived to be 83. I think that was pretty much unheard of back then. That was a ripe old age.